Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Creedon, and I'll be your host for today's webinar on how to use PCI DSS for a stronger IT security posture and streamline your compliance efforts. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. Today's presentation will last about 50 minutes, and the slides can be downloaded at www.wolfandco.com/webinars/2018. You have two options for audio today. You may dial in by phone or listen through your computer. Our audience will be muted during the session, so if you have questions at any point, please send them in to me by using the questions box located on the webinar's control panel. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. I'd now like to give a brief background of the firm. Wolf & Company was established in 1911 and have 2 centuries of experience providing our clients with assurance, tax, business consulting, risk management services, and we have over 250 professionals working for the firm. We have offices in Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts, Albany, New York, and Livingston, New Jersey. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Sean Goodwin. Sean serves as a senior consultant in our IT assurance department. Thank you for presenting today, Sean, and I'll now hand the presentation over to you to get started.
Thank you, Stephanie. All right, so as Stephanie mentioned, I'm a senior consultant in the IT assurance group at Wolf, specifically working a lot in the PCI team, and one of the PCI specializations for me happens to be with the service provider side of the DSS. So a little bit about today. You got to know me. A lot of my focus in the PCI world, like I said, is with the service provider side of the data security standards. So working with companies that have multiple environments or multiple processes involving cardholder data, which often presents a lot of complicated compliance efforts. And these service providers typically are involved with more than just cardholder data. And a lot of what they end up having to do is juggle compliance requirements for a number of different frameworks. And what we're hoping to touch on today is using DSS as the more prescriptive control for overall compliance, using this to really drive compliance efforts across the organization, and then starting to tailor fit some of those other frameworks, whether it's trying to work with high trust or using something like the NIST cybersecurity framework or the CIS top 20 critical security controls. For each of these areas, what we're going to do is touch on some of these really core competencies that we want to start by implementing first, highlight some of the common pitfalls we typically see during implementation and kind of maintenance of those controls, and touch on how to avoid some of the big mistakes that we see, and hopefully get a more stable control environment for your organization. So when we're looking to use the PCI DSS as an overall security strategy, service providers, or really any company with several business lines or several different compliance requirements, are really going to benefit here. A common complaint we hear as auditors when we go into a company is trying to keep up with all these different compliance requirements, different control frameworks. Just about every auditor is asking for very similar evidence, but potentially framed slightly different. So what we typically look to is use the DSS and kind of take a step back. So the DSS is written towards cardholder data, but it also happens to be one of the more prescriptive control frameworks, actually giving you exact controls to implement. And this is really designed with best practice in mind. So throughout the DSS, you'll see that NIST, SANS, OWASP, CIS are all referenced throughout. So you are getting reliance from some of these well-recognized industry best practices. And then the PCI Council took those one step further to actually give you specific controls to implement and take out some of that gray area. So as I said, it is written towards cardholder data, but when working through this exercise, we really want to look at the control, looking at your key data rather than just cardholder data. Obviously, when your PCI auditor comes in or you're working through a self-assessment questionnaire, you will want to refocus back in on the cardholder data, but this can be used for any other any progress towards any other compliance requirement, whether it's PII, EPHI, anything that your business or that business unit considers key is really what we want to be looking at. And a lot of these controls are really, a nice balance between providing some security, obviously getting you the compliance check mark, but also not causing excessive overhead through management. Many of the controls we'll be talking about actually provide a security function. There are always going to be compliance tasks that seem like duplicate work or sometimes unnecessary review, which isn't what we're looking to get at here. We are looking to pull out those key controls that you can implement across the organization and really get to a baseline of security. So right here, we do want to focus on security first. If you're working towards being secure, compliance is easy to fill in those gaps for those nuanced controls. But if you follow these security best practices, the compliance will be much easier to get there. So before we jump into specific controls and some of those pitfalls and mitigations, there are a few things you need to start off with. One of the biggest benefits and most successful organizations we've seen have a formal project management responsibility assigned. We've seen this as a project management office and actually a group that their sole function is managing projects like this. And while that's great, that's certainly not possible or the case in every organization. So when you can't have a dedicated project manager, we do look for information security, IT security, that kind of ITIS realm to be involved with project management. If you're on a smaller team, this may end up being a committee-based approach where you have periodic meetings to review the plans and look at your progress, but you do need some sort of formal assignment where there's a person or a very small group of people that are actually taking ownership of the overall security process and going to carry this through to the finish. Once you have that assignment, identifying the organizational overlaps is difficult. Identifying all the different compliance frameworks, does take some work. And two of these, the data inventory and the standard configurations are going to relate to those organizational overlaps. So what I mean with organizational overlaps is as we work through these controls, our goal is going to be to identify the lowest common denominator where we can implement these controls with minimal or ideally no deviations across the board. And then each business line will start to take that baseline and build on that for their specific compliance requirements. So as an example, if you have a retail side, whether it's actually retail store locations or you happen to take payment from your customers or your clients via credit card, you have that sales aspect. that silo or that business line is going to have to worry about some of these PCI specific controls that may not apply to another business line that's involved in the healthcare space, where some of the high trust specific controls are, they require more overhead or are stricter towards the security side of the house than you may necessarily want as your baseline. So what you'll want to do is identify the highest sensitivity level per silo. And this is something, as you work through, you're going to start to identify both control overlaps, and then occasionally there's going to be direct contradictions. An easy one to think of is authentication requirements. Using PCI as the baseline here, the password controls aren't very strong. They're calling for a 7-character minimum password, some complexity, and forced rotations. When you look at recent publications from NIST, the length isn't a significant change, but some of the big differences there have to do with no longer forcing password rotation and a lot more focus on the actual password composition. So that's an example where you may have business lines that are differing. Look at the least common denominator, and if you're comfortable with using PCI in that case, you'll have that low-level password policy, whether it's across the environment or for that business unit. And then for some of these other business units, you can start to increase the requirements. So you'll want to do that as you work through each of these business lines you're really taking on in this project. We'll want to look at what data they have, how they're storing and processing that data, and then what's really the impact if that data is exposed for each of those lines, and map out an overall inventory, and then also mapping out really the worst case scenario, or the most critical, most sensitive data for each one of those. So with that, the first control we're going to talk about isn't necessarily one control, and it's kind of a bigger chunk than the others we'll get to. But change control is something just about every organization has some sort of struggle with. When looking at using the DSS as your baseline security initiative, that's really foundational to the DSS itself. If you can't control what changes are being made in your environment, you can't really enforce any other control that's there. The DSS does have one of the 12 requirements completely dedicated to designing and maintaining those systems, which is all change control related. Enforcement of the testing requirements. So a lot of what we'll see kind of for the initial implementations with change control, and where a lot of places start, is you do have to develop a change control policy and identify how changes will be handled in your environment. With this, one of the big things that's often overlooked and really acts as a roadblock to full change control implementation is evidence of those changes. The policy should be developed to actually identify any of the required evidence for each stage. So if something's moving from dev to pre-prod, what sort of testing evidence is required there? If you're moving from pre-prod to QA to UAT to production, really identifying what's going to be required all along the way and providing the checklist to those folks that actually have to implement the changes is going to be key. They're likely not security professionals, and you do want to provide them with as little friction or as much guidance as possible. That way they can follow this process. You'll also want to make sure you can hook your change control process into just about every other operational process going on within IT. And you're going to want to go ahead and monitor the performance of that change control process. A key example of this happens to be looking at vulnerability management is something Every month, every week when you're running your scans, there's constantly missing patches, weak configurations, things being addressed. You do want to have some tie-in to your change control process there. You do want to monitor for performance. So what I mean there with those two is you run a vulnerability scan weekly. You do want to make sure that proposed change does go through your change control board, committee, whatever it happens to be. And you'll want to monitor for performance. So part of that committee or board's process should be looking for evidence of changes that didn't go through your change control board or committee. That does tie in with some of the other controls we'll get to as far as logging and alerting, kind of monitoring these systems. But change control does need to be a full circle process from identifying the change, actually testing the change, validating the appropriate change was made afterwards, and then also monitoring for any unauthorized changes. This is something across the board. If you have a solid change control process in place and you're starting to implement additional controls, through this process, you'll have that peace of mind that the infrastructure and your environment is maturing. The controls you're implementing are remaining in place, people aren't working around them, and you are working towards a more secure state. So some of the common pitfalls we'll see when trying to implement an organizational-wide change control policy. Membership of the change control board. Something a lot of folks struggle with, and getting the right folks in the room on the distribution list in both directions. A lot of times people focus in too much in just the IT department, where everyone's got hands on keyboard, but they're not really focused on the end users and what their impact might be with those changes. And the flip side of the coin, unfortunately, is if the change control process is being developed due to an audit or regulatory finding, a lot of times there's excessive involvement from senior leadership where they understand the risks and these things need to be implemented, but they're removed from the day-to-day hands-on keyboard, and again, may not understand the full picture of the risk being presented by each proposed change. So to sum it up, a big focus there is really honing in on getting the right level of involvement for your change committee. That's going to really differ by each organization, but it is something you want to have representation from the business unit as well as operations, and then you do want to have almost optional attendance from some non-operational but other background internal groups. Human resources, legal are definitely things to consider there. The change control policy and procedure documentation. Again, this is something documentation always tends to lag behind. We do want to have a full change control policy that's, again, a shorter document outlining the why for why we're developing this process. But that detailed procedure documentation is something I was referring to earlier. Things like those requirements for each stage through the change control process that you can hand to your developers, your IT team, any of the business units, just so they know what to expect out of a change process. Any step-by-step or checklist guidance you can provide to those end users is really a great way to make sure your process is being followed. And the last one here, monitoring for unauthorized changes. So this is definitely the last step in kind of the more mature change control environment. You do want to have a process in place to identify unauthorized changes. Some examples, that you'll see here are identifying standard configurations to machines and having a process to alert on them. Without getting into too much detail for that we'll get to, Active Directory and GPO or Puppet and Chef with Linux machines are an easy example where you can show that these configurations are being set in an independent system, and that's really enforcing those settings on the production environment. As far as real-world examples, so looking at a change control process that seemed to be working well and then really went wrong. So looking at the Meltdown and Spectre patches, specifically with Microsoft, I'm sure there are a number of people here today that went through, a lot of stress when this was first released, and then significant headaches in the patching process that followed. So it was certainly a high-profile vulnerability. It was all over the news. Lots of alerts went out, and it was actually, patches were made available pretty quickly. A lot of folks saw the criticality of these machines and the impact of this vulnerability with more and more workforces being totally mobile. Everyone's on laptops. We really do need to make sure our machines are being patched quickly for things like this. The issue that came up, Microsoft had been provided with outdated documentation from AMD, so the patch they initially released, led to a lot of trouble, and many organizations actually ended up with machines that were unbootable as a result of that first patch. And what we can see here is organizations that have a strong change control process can identify that. A lot of times we'll see these emergency change control processes that try and skip some of these critical steps as far as testing and a dedicated rollout. For this specific example, if your emergency change control process is to push the patch to everyone, it's coming from a trusted vendor in Microsoft, push the patch to everyone, and then we'll talk about it next week at the next change control meeting, you're likely to have significant issues there. So things like this do require a balance. Certainly an emergency change control process is needed, but you do want to still have some level of testing and validation before deploying to production. For an organization that went through a full process, they likely, may have pushed the patch to a small test group of users and hopefully identified that issue before really rolling that out to their entire environment. So data inventory. So once you have that change control process in place, you can use that to start building out some of these controls. As I mentioned, and as I'm sure everyone's aware, PCI really hones in on the cardholder data. So a few specific fields in your database, web app, physical copies of data, that's really what the DSS is built on. And what we're looking for you to do here is identify your key data. So whether that's personally identifiable information, electronic protected health information, anything else that you deem key to your business. It may even just be proprietary information internally that you need to protect. So the first thing right off the bat is identifying how you can protect or devalue that data. In the PCI world, we really look to perform any data tokenization that we can. So what that is, and this can certainly be done with any other type of data, is devaluing the data through a one-way hash. So rather than a 16-digit card number, we now have, say, a 16-digit random character string. This involves a third party, essentially a data broker, that is storing that data, but your database is now no longer valuable information. If someone steals that token value, that doesn't map back to any card number, can't be used for any other fraudulent purchases. So anytime you can tokenize any of your data, that's obviously great and can help mitigate any data loss at that point. Then we have the data encryption. So when you can't necessarily tokenize it, whether it's health information or someone's personally identifiable information that you do need to retain, encrypting it is a great way to go. There you can at least, through a access control process, manage who can get to the clear text data. And again, if the data is exposed, the value is reduced there. You do want to perform this process, so the scope review, really identifying what is your key data, where is it stored, who has access to it, what sort of forms does it take? Is it just stored on a file share? Is it printed out to paper reports? Is it backed up to some cloud provider? We do want to reperform this at least annually. This does involve interviewing personnel. There are certainly tools you can use, both commercial and open source solutions, to help with the initial identification, but it's certainly not an end-all be-all. What we've done in a few organizations is, after they've performed that initial, essentially scan for matching strings across file shares and databases, they can try and identify what sort of data they have in place. Performing the interviews and really asking simple questions to those business line folks. They may initially think you're looking for IT specific language, but really trying to just learn what they do day in and day out, and how they really get their job done, more often than not reveals all sorts of other processes that a standard email out to the manager or a scan of that department's file share may not have revealed, to identify an additional location or additional use case of that data. So some of the pitfalls we see here, going right off of that, is undocumented processes. Whether it's the way the team or the business unit is working with the data, or how they're actually exporting it into reports, whether it's hard copy or soft copy, and where they're storing it. Like I said, this is very common. A lot of people still like to essentially perform their own backups, whether it's they're saving things to their local drive or they're using things like cloud storage. A lot of folks have their own methods to their madness ingrained. They'll keep spreadsheets locally, or they'll print out a copy of all sorts of status reports that end up having sensitive information on them. Or they've decided to leverage this new technology that is the cloud, and now all of a sudden they're saving things to Box or Dropbox, or any of the other cloud-based file storage you have out there. Really identifying the use cases of that comes down to interviewing those personnel, as well as having that training and awareness in place. Another common pitfall we see here is legacy backups. And here can be, this is one of those intersections where some compliance can kind of combat your security goals. And that's really when you have retention requirements for certain compliance frameworks. There are certainly concerns to be had with keeping that data around, and that's really when that tokenization and data encryption can come into play. Looking at, say you're using tape backups or disk backups and moving them offsite to retain for a certain amount of time, making sure that you have that strong encryption and key management process in place, as well as that inventory showing what tapes are on or offsite with what sort of data is on them. Make sure that in the event something happens, you can quickly go to that inventory and identify what the potential scope is. Those backups will almost always be an issue for you, where you will have to retain some sort of offsite backup that's going to contain sensitive data. Making sure you have that inventory to quickly identify what sort of data was exposed and how you can treat some sort of incident, whether it's a lost tape or any other event involving those. So looking at this, we had a client that was having some issues with getting to that data inventory and brought us in to really help with that interview process. It's one of those when you bring in a third party, it's much easier for me to ask the questions not fully understanding the business process rather than an insider, because I am a new face and really don't have any assumptions to work off of and gear questions. So we can almost ask anything and everything. So we happened to be talking to an accounts payable, accounts receivable, was, I believe, the entire accounting team sitting there. But there was essentially undisclosed backups of cardholder data is what it turned out to be. So what they were doing was when phone payments would come in, they had some issues with the speed of the card processing with their the hand terminal. So what they were doing was they went ahead and kept a spreadsheet that they set on the accounting share, so only the accounting department was supposed to have access to it. But they were going ahead and entering in card data there to make sure they could go ahead and then process those payments later. Obviously, this is much less than ideal when it comes to PCI, but looking at this sort of information, if this is health information or anything else proprietary, how comfortable are you with that information being on a networked drive? Are your access reviews thorough enough to actually protect that information? As the conversation went on, it turns out that several employees were also either printing off copies or saving copies of that spreadsheet locally. So now, not only do we have this version of a spreadsheet on a network drive, but now there's several workstation machines with this data saved locally. Not only do we have a retention issue, now we really don't have access over that data anymore. So really the biggest point to drive home with this one is that awareness for the employees, to let them know what your processes are for handling this data, how to detect this sort of data. So having an internal process to interview business lines, perform some of those automated or even manual scans of the network to try and identify some of that sensitive information. Standard configurations here is probably where you'll see the biggest benefit in automation. So a lot of what we look for both in PCI and some of these other compliance requirements is knowing not only what's in your environment, maintaining an inventory, but knowing how those devices are configured. Being able to standardize your build images, whether it's through group policy with Windows, Puppet or Chef for Linux. This is really where you want to focus in on what's the, again, lowest common denominator for those machines. Can we just have one image for an application server or one image for a web server? Identify what that image is going to look like with minimal exceptions made for different business lines and deploy that, and then rely on incremental changes as needed for those business lines, again, flowing through that change control process so that when a change is made, if business line A needs a change made to their database server, the change control board can review that, assess the change against those other business lines, and maybe rather than being an exception, you can update that as your standard, and every other business line can still run without an issue. Those exceptions to policy become unmanageable pretty quickly. So what we want to do there, after minimizing any exceptions to the policy, is really keep that exception inventory up to date and keep that reviewed. A lot of times you'll see a few different groups requesting an exception to a standard, to the point where you may need to, back off your standard, come down maybe to a less secure than intended setting because of one of your business lines wants that more secure, and now that can be the exception where the standard for the other business lines is a little looser. Biggest pitfall here is inherited systems. This is something a lot of teams struggle with, and it's due to a few different things. A lot of times there's a lot of turnover in an IT department where there may be 2 or 3 generations of folks that have cycled through the IT department since your core application was built internally. A lot of people have been able to kind of learn enough to keep things running, but there's not that core understanding where they can make significant upgrades to it. This typically leads to a lot of exceptions to policy, and it is something organizations struggle with. A lot of times you will have to make those exceptions for some of these, and their application for whatever reason can only run on server 2003 because some of the functionality is outdated. It's been a project plan for a year, but you do have to keep that exception open, which is perfectly valid. And there are going to be times when you do have to deal with these exceptions to policy. But that is something to keep in mind as that system brings in more and more exceptions to your standard. Is that risk starting to outweigh the cost of rebuilding the environment? In some cases, that may not be the case, but more often than not, teams do start to reach the tipping point where the exceptions are no longer worth the exposure it's bringing to the environment. A root cause analysis really helps you identify common changes that can be made to those images. A real tie-in here is with your vulnerability and patch management process. In a few instances we've seen those standard images are maintained just as current, if not more current, than their production patching environment. Where this tends to drop off is especially infrequent changes. So not a system that's being patched, monthly, like an application, web server, anything like that. Maybe it's your hypervisor image. At most, maybe patched quarterly, oftentimes even less than that. Those images are often built once, and then if you need to spin something up, there's a significant amount of downtime while you're trying to get that patched up to date. Making sure that those baseline images are included in your standard configuration maintenance really speeds up your deployment process. And then, like I said, documenting and tracking those exceptions will really be great. This is what's going to give you that real risk based view of the environment. You'll be able to see business line A has presented 15 exceptions to our standard builds. That's certainly something that requires an additional look. Are there exceptions really risks to our standard baseline? Are they something that can be carried across the environment and start to minimize those exceptions? So Equifax and the Apache Struts vulnerability. So this one is a little bit interesting due to the fact that they had processes in place that really should have or could have mitigated the issue. So here, the lack of vulnerability identification and remediation, that really is the case. And when you start to look at the details, it's not that they didn't have a process in place to identify those issues and start to work towards remediation. So For a quick timeline here, the vulnerability was disclosed on March 7th. A lot of people saw the US CERT notification come out that afternoon, and a patch was released the very next day. They happened to discover their intrusion at the end of July, so several months later. Where this really got interesting was once the CEO was testifying in front of Congress, they had a process in place to run scans that should have identified this vulnerability. So when you start to boil this down, there were a few potential failures here, again, without knowing their internal processes. A few things may have happened. They didn't have a detailed standard configuration to identify where Struts was being used in their environment, or the process for the vulnerability scanner they were using wasn't updating its definitions timely. So a week after the patch was released, any scanner would have had those definitions, likely even the next day after that was identified. So a week later, and who knows how many scans were run between March 15th and the final discovery at the end of July. These things, do happen, and this is why having a detailed standard build can really help your organization. Identify what software is installed by default, tracking any exceptions to that, and really keeping that inventory up to date. As far as access control, so this is something a lot of organizations, especially with PCI requirements, have been starting to express more concern over with the new quote unquote requirements this year, especially in the service provider area. So there were 9 new requirements, one of them hitting both service providers and merchants, has to do with the multi-factor authentication for any of the remote administrative access. One of the things, kind of the biggest win you can have for your access control is single sign-on anywhere and everywhere that's possible. So for the most case, this is going to be integrating with Active Directory, using group level access to control everything from file shares to systems to even the networking gear for your networking or infrastructure team. Being able to centralize this access control makes it easier for you to get a full view of who has access to what machines, what sort of times, if you're using time of day restriction, what type of access they have, whether it's read-only, read-write, etc. From there, network segmentation is going to be key for controlling access. Isolating the environment by silo or by business line is great. What's going to happen there is your networking or infrastructure team and likely your security team is going to need to have access to all of those silos. But for the most part, your organization can really be pared down to the amount of access they can have. Where this comes into play a lot is looking at penetration tests and seeing any of the pivoting from machine to machine. A common example is looking at moving from one workstation to another through some of the default Microsoft services. A lot of people have been struggling with NetBIOS and LLM&R, and seeing specifically logins or traffic going from one workstation to another. An easy thing to do here is restrict that workstation to workstation communication. Likely no one outside of your infrastructure support team needs that type of access, and then even further isolating your silos or business lines, looking at things like worm prevention, even going back to worms and viruses, reducing what machines any one user can see. And principle of least privilege, this is something the CIS critical security controls really takes a step further than most other frameworks do. But at a minimum, identifying separate user IDs for admin users. Something a lot of organizations, may kind of smile or laugh at here, but we see more often than not, admins do in fact have two separate user IDs. But because things are difficult between logging out, logging in, they really end up using their admin account more than they necessarily need to. Because it's easier. They save their scripts locally. They have all sorts of favorites or shortcuts to RDP or SSH sessions, and they end up just using that as their daily driver account. So really implementing that process to have the separate accounts and then enforcing the appropriate usage of those is going to be really key. Role-based access control is really going to be the biggest factor here. And once you're standardized and centralized, you can really drive that point home. Now that you've gotten to this point, you've already identified the critical data assets and where certain critical data is living. You can use that to feed the role-based access. Do these folks really need access to all three file shares here? Can we start to pare it down? Can we get even more granular? The biggest pitfall happen to see here is privilege creep. And this typically involves employees that have been with the company for several years, possibly a few different departments, definitely a few other roles. And the access process, they kept having access added to their profile, but no one was really checking to pare down the access. Where we see this somewhat fall short with the access reviews is looking at active user profiles in the environment and comparing that against an HR roster, which is certainly a great first line of defense. Are all these employees still active in our environment? Do they need user accounts? A lot of people don't go the one step further to actually look at what access is where. And a real benefit you have with centralizing that access control, whether it's through Active Directory or something else, is the ability to script and automate the process where you can really pull out those group level access roles and distribute the review. This isn't something security or IT necessarily has the understanding to accurately review. So you certainly feel free, and we definitely encourage leveraging the business lines for this review. You want to make sure they're signing off as the owner of a system on any of the users, and you're providing the information and the management of those users. This is something a lot of folks in the healthcare industry have been somewhat struggling with as high trust is pushed or required of more and more organizations. Access control and really reviewing that access is a big factor. So looking at this, again, a lot of people I'm sure are aware, at least at a high level, of the target breach. This started with a third-party access into their network, heating and cooling vendor. They would have to VPN in to submit different payment requests. From there, the network was fairly flat and there was a lack of segmentation. And then as part of the Verizon review after the breach, they had shared local admin credentials across the entire environment. And then on top of that, they did have a password policy in place requiring, matching up with the Microsoft recommendations for long, complex passwords. Turns out during the Verizon review, that actually wasn't being enforced. So the policy was there on paper, but systematically was not being enforced. So a lot of access control failures here. Third-party access into the network certainly, can be justified, but the internal segmentation is a big failure there. We really need to isolate internal and external parties to those assets they need access to. Standard local admin credentials. Once one machine was compromised, they got to that local admin credential from memory in one of the machines, and that gave them ownership of every machine in the environment. This is something that often comes up in various pen test reports as well. Luckily for Microsoft environments, LAPS really does a good job at mitigating this risk. And then there are other things you can monitor for and set registry keys to prevent some of that clear text storage in memory, and looking for things like Mimikatz or LSAS access to those password files in memory. And then lastly, the password policy not being enforced. It's one thing to define the policy, but then again, if it's not being enforced, you really don't have that control in place. Activity monitoring, so the last one here, all systems in your environment. This is going to be a lot of work, probably the most work of all of these controls. Networking equipment, switches, routers, hopefully not firewalls, are often overlooked, but can certainly provide a lot of good insight, not necessarily for initial breach detection, but looking for that lateral movement within your environment. Knowing this is going to be a really big investment of time and resources, really starting with administrative or privileged users and more or less work your way down each user type or role as you mature in the environment. One of the big issues we'll see here is turn logging on for all types of logs for all machines in the environment. Now all of a sudden you're inundated with log files, and you end up hitting Control-A, Control-Q for those alert emails, and no longer have a review process, but you've got that false sense of security. So you do want to start small with those key users or key systems and expand out from there. An example here, so starting with security issues first and foremost, and then expanding that log type out, just like we're going to do with the role level. Look at different types of activities that may be relevant. So especially with PII or EPHI, starting to look at access requests for other employee files or VIPs, people of interest. If you have celebrities or high profile people coming in, there really needs to be an oversight of who's looking up those records to prevent that breach of privacy. Limitations here that we commonly come across. The use of built-in admin accounts. A lot of older systems or even some database systems now, there are certain actions that can only be performed by a built-in admin account or built-in root, something like that. A lot of issues tend to come with direct access to those machines with that root or built-in admin account. So where possible, we look for changing profiles locally. So if it's a Windows environment, using the run as command to elevate up to an administrative user. In a Linux environment, sudoing up. For some of these other environments, really looking to password vaulting solutions where you may not be able to log on the appliance in question, but we can at least log and monitor that password vault for who's accessing a credential at any given time. Independent monitoring of activity is a big struggle just about anywhere. Having someone that understands what they're looking at, but is also independent of the activity can be really difficult. And even finding two people to review each other can certainly be an issue, but is really where the monitoring needs to get. With a small team, performing that review somewhat as a group or having at least two people dedicated to reviewing does mitigate that conflict of interest, but we do need to watch out for vacations, time off, things like that, where you need to have someone to fill in and keep those reviews independent. And retention of these logs. This is something, looking again at PCI, we do have a retention requirement. You have to have 3 months immediately available with an additional 9 months after that for a full year available offsite. As you start to expand the scope of systems and the types of audit logs being recorded, we do want to keep that in mind. Disk space can be cheap, but when you start to get up into the hundreds of gigs, perhaps terabytes of data, that is going to be a concern. So certainly when you can compress down for offsite storage, get that offsite as quickly as possible. Make sure you're retaining as long as you're required to. But really, once you can compress those flat files rather than keeping something in your SIM, you can get a good amount of disk space back. Alert fatigue is the last concern here. Tailoring your real-time alerting versus passive alerting or passive reviews to a level that you can actually review and respond to. If the team monitoring your alerts can investigate 50 alerts a day, make sure you've tuned your alerts to just generate those top 50 most critical alerts. As they mature, get better, maybe the team grows, you can expand that logging out, but you really don't want to overload with alerts. That's when things start to get missed, and you start to get that alert fatigue where alerts start to get ignored as quote unquote false positives, and you start to have issues like the target scenario. So I know we're starting to run short on time here, so some quick stats from the Verizon data breach investigation report around alerting that really call this monitoring into focus. So 12% of the breaches they looked at for this year's report involved the misuse of privileged credentials. So that's anything from the stolen admin credentials to, again, credentials being used for things they shouldn't be, whether it's shared, daily drivers, etc. 68% of the breaches took months or longer to discover. So there's certainly not an active or detailed enough review of activity in the environment. There was a pretty even distribution of assets being targeted. So there isn't just one thing you can monitor. You do have to be enterprise-wide. And then an interesting point this year happened to be a big spike in breaches tied to misdelivery of information. And an interesting thing to look out for, many people, when we think activity monitoring, they're looking at system logs. This happened to be a massive spike in breaches just from people using the autocomplete in their email and sending off sensitive information to the wrong person. So your activity monitoring does need to be tailored to your environment. How is data being used, accessed, and distributed throughout your environment? So with that, I know we're right up against the bell here, but if there are any questions, I'd certainly like to answer those.
Hi, Sean. So we have two questions, and it looks like we just have a few minutes, so perfect timing. The first one is, have you seen success with automating any of the data discovery in place of interviews? Our organization has a large footprint, and conducting interviews, walkthroughs may not be feasible.
Sure. So yeah, this is certainly something I would recommend using that automated discovery as a first step. As far as replacing it entirely, I don't think that necessarily will get you the full coverage you're looking for. But using things, whether it's an enterprise solution that will really kind of have all the bells and whistles for you, or even looking at some of the freely available tools out on GitHub, anything like that, can certainly help frame the discussion. It does help when you go into an interview with a group, having some level of understanding where if you can point out specific reports with some of this key information, it can kind of prompt that discussion and help that carry along. Let them know you're trying to understand their business function and not necessarily just trying to bring down the hammer and implement these controls.
Great. And next question we received is, we have several compliance requirements to follow. Is there a crosswalk or mapping of all these different frameworks we can use to identify the overlap?
Sure, and that's something that certainly comes up a good amount. The CIS Critical Security Controls has a number of different posters that provide a really good crosswalk. The one disclaimer I'll give with that is the CSCs were recently updated, so make sure you are looking at current versions of the crosswalk. Another item to look at that is sometimes a little tougher to obtain the documentation, but looking at the high trust controls as they're spelt out, it won't necessarily provide a big crosswalk like the CIS poster does, but they do call out all the other frameworks that overlap with the specific control, and really helps kind of build that crosswalk out internally.
Great. Thanks, Sean, for all that insight. It looks like our time is up, so if anybody does have a question after the webinar has concluded, please feel free to follow up with Sean directly. His contact information is listed on the slide. And as a reminder, copies of today's presentation are available at www.wolfandco.com/webinars/2018. I will also be posting a recording of this presentation to the same web address later on today. Immediately following the conclusion of this webinar, you'll have the opportunity to complete a survey. As always, we appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to improve our webinar program. Thanks so much for attending today, and we look forward to your participation in future webinars. Have a great afternoon, everyone.